Hi, I'm Derek Jensen, estate attorney and host of Who Gets What. Walter Young is a life insurance specialist, best-selling author, and my friend. His book, The Fifth Option, is an exploration of how to break out of the retirement trap, using an old tool that many people may have questions about, life insurance. Walter and I talk about his new financial literacy course, Running Your Family Like a Business, and how to push past the financial traps. Here's our conversation. I think all families have a family wealth story. We're not just talking about the Rockefellers. We're talking about my own family. We're talking about your family too.
I probably have the opposite of family wealth story. My mom was an immigrant to this country and a single mother. So money was always kind of on the conversation. We had enough, but not plenty. My brother and I just grew up just understanding a little bit more about scarcity. We never talked about money. And I think that's probably, the normal, the average family out there. My mom had no idea what to do with money and oftentimes made poor choices with her money. Obviously had impact on us growing up. We're at a point now where we do have to start to have a money story and understand that we're not after money for money's sake, but we're after what money can mean for us and the things that it can do for us. When I sit down with clients, a lot of times what I like to do is try to bring in the kids into the conversation and just get a sense for, what does legacy mean? And how will you want this to manifest itself? And what kinds of things can we impart to your children in terms of being a responsible steward of the money that they may inherit? Because for some of these people, they're going to inherit a lot of money. And if we're not careful, it could have some of those negative effects that we hear about with, second, third generations of true wealth.
And even the scarcity of wealth is a family wealth story. And that, I'm sure, influenced you and your attention to this subject, and maybe even helped you have a passion for it. So wanting to help others to get to a spot where they had more security. That kind of gets into the whole idea of, managing your wealth and kind of managing for where you're going and finding yourself in a different financial situation.
What's interesting on my end is there's kind of an evolution, a confluence of things that are happening. First, I would argue that the generations, our kids coming up and maybe even a little bit older, I always start off by telling them, you're more responsible for your own financial outcome than ever before. And sometimes that creates a lot of anxiety because they're realizing, okay, what do I do? And sometimes that creates a lot of excitement because it means anything is possible. And what's happening in the financial world is we're seeing the erosion or the destruction of what we used to call the three-legged financial stool, which was pensions, Social Security, and some personal savings. And so now we certainly know that, pensions are all but gone at this point. Social Security is, kind of a shaky mess, and people are having a hard time saving. So there's a lot of conversation right now about how is this next generation going to create that wealth and protect that wealth going forward. And I think the second confluence that's happening that's interesting is the evolution of the worker, where we used to be an employee and we worked for a company for 30 years and we had the gold watch and we had the mortgage burning parties and all the stuff that the company did for us. And they would give us a pension and ship us off into retirement. And we've really evolved now to the point where even W-2 workers, just have a tax label because they're all independent contractors at this point. We're moving around a lot more. And so it just takes a different mindset today in today's financial planning world, which I akin much more to being self-employed than a W-2 worker, and therefore running your house more like a business than ever before. And I think that's some of the interesting things that are starting to come to light.
And do people have much training on that? I imagine even talking with folks on being an entrepreneur is not something that, unless you have that kind of in your blood, you're very comfortable for. At least that's the way it seems.
That's exactly right. People are not trained for this. This is not something you learn in school. And even though I have an MBA, I could tell you I might have had one class about actual personal financial planning. And I was talking to a professor at Rutgers. He's an MBA professor at Rutgers, formerly on Wall Street. And he told me the first thing that his students, when they get to Wall Street and are becoming these highly successful traders, the first thing they call him and they ask him, what do I do with my own money? Which is kind of an ironic thing to ask, because they're the people that are going to be at the Morgan Stanleys, doing all these tradings, but they really don't have a sense for how personal financial planning works. And I think that's an area where, we have a lot of opportunity to help educate, people from our age all the way down to our kids.
Well, one of the things I've been studying and trying to learn from is those in the high net worth or the ultra high net worth, because they've seen these issues from a different side. And one of the problems many of their kids have is they don't know how to do many of the basic financial things. I mean, even balancing a checkbook or paying for the car insurance. These are things that are taken care of for them, and so then they're trying to become independent. They're out on their own, and they have no background on this at all, and they have to all be trained in even the most basic, what we would consider financial literacy, right?
Yeah, that's right. At the higher levels, higher income levels or higher net worth levels, we definitely see a kind of a disconnect between the person who earned the money and the generations after that, where they're disassociated from what it took to get there, and so they're not trained, they're not taught, and that really has to come from a family value that they put that as a priority for their next generations. We've heard the expression short sleeves in 3 generations, which basically just says, the first generation makes the money, by the third generation, it gets diffused. Unless you have really a great family culture that helps teach people how to be responsible with these finances. And I think that's a really lacking part of that upper wealth society that you're talking about.
And so thinking of the family as a business, you're bringing into the conversation then other family members, the children, and into the inner workings. What does that actually look like for a family?
Yeah, so I've seen a few things. One is sometimes I've seen people develop what they call a family constitution, which is really a document that talks about what the family values are and how money supports the values that the family espouses, right? So one of the things that I try to teach folks is, if we think of ourselves as a business, then a lot of people think that what our families make is money. And yes, we get paid every 2 weeks, and yes, we have money. We need to deal with money. But the reality is the money really needs to provide relationships and experiences and evidence of a life well lived. And that only comes when we assign and align our money with our values, right? And I think a lot of times we don't spend time thinking about what's important to us. And you might start with the question, what's important to you about money? And really start to understand that at the beginning stages, that first answer typically is something like, well, I have to be able to pay my bills. And if you start by asking, well, what's important to you about paying your bills, then people will usually respond by something like, I can sleep better at night. And when people can sleep better at night, then they have less anxiety and can start thinking about what they want to do when they get to retirement. And that's really where that value statement comes in, is what would you do if money isn't part of that, part of an anxiety, or, if money is not an issue. And so we want to just understand, how can we align our money towards our values so that we're living values? Because I think when you live your values, that's when true fulfillment really is part of the equation at that point.
So earlier you were talking about the family constitution. Can you expand on that?
So the Constitution that I've seen is really meant to be able to bring the values and the goals of the family into real life and into a document form, where the family is documented. And this document is kind of what runs the business, because kind of like a mission or a vision statement, where the family coalesces around what's important to them and how they're going to organize their finances to support that. And depending on the size and wealth and age of children, the children get introduced into what this value system is and how to plug into it. This can be as involved as going on retreats and making sure that family members reconnect and remember what's important and be able to to live by the Constitution. It's a way to provide more financial literacy for the kids. And so it's a kind of a unique thing where people just take, a lot of us probably just think what's important to us in our head, but we never really get it down into a document that we could share and show that's concrete with our family members.
Of course, I'm a document guy. That's kind of my business. And we have a number of documents that we turn to often too. We can actually create a business. We can create a family LLC, for example, which can have a very elaborate structure, or it could be less structured. Many people will have family businesses, maybe a corporate form, in fact. And sometimes the families will run those a bit too much like a business. They forget that on the voting or the shareholders, and maybe we forget about the stakeholders. So there's others that maybe don't actually have ownership shares, right, in the entities that might be created. But the family constitution idea is here that we're bringing everyone into that. So it's a very much of a positive. The family value, or the value of the money, and how we view that isn't just us individually. We get a lot of influence from that, from our family story, you kind of pointed to 30 as being a key age, and that's an interesting spot. I know that when I'm talking with my clients and I ask them, how much they've shared with their kids, often it's like, oh no, it's all closed up. They're not allowing any of that information out. But even that is influencing their children, right? Because they're seeing many of what's going on in their life.
100%. With all the tools and things. I mean, I've heard stories where people, you can look up your house on Zillow and figure out how many millions it's worth. What's challenging is if you don't share some of how it's managed or how to be responsible with it, you could just take it for granted, right? Parents are wealthy, and I never really learned that the building blocks or the tools or the appreciation for what it took to get it, and more importantly, people who have money, they want to learn what it takes to keep it, right? Nobody wants to go back and have to re-earn it after you've made the money, right? And so teaching being able to teach that generation, I think is critically important for that transparency.
So if we think of the family as a business, what roles would the children have?
I view the parents as the shareholders, right? So like if we think about the parallels of a business has assets and liabilities, and so do you. A business has expenses and revenue, and so do you. A business has to deal with taxes, and so do you. And businesses have shareholders, and so do us, right? It's ourselves, and I would consider our kids to be the junior shareholders, right? They're the next line up of the business, right? They eventually might inherit the business if that's the legacy that we provide to the children. And so it's really valuable to think of them as junior shareholders, begin to sit in on the board meetings and learn what it's like to actually run a business. Now, if you go to the high end where the family offices exist, sometimes those kids are part of those meetings at some point, right? Where they're sitting down and working with the board of directors that might be part of that family office. But most people, it's more of a virtual family office. And so I think it'd be really helpful to begin to think of them as junior shareholders and try to teach them as if, they're going to be the next generation of managing this wealth.
I'm glad you brought up the point about the ultra high wealthy. They definitely have education for the different generations. It is very much structured, where they'll even have retreats. They'll have a coursework, and so they have their family meeting, and they may break up into little subsections, and they'll bring in instructors and experts on different subjects. So that's very much part of what they have as resources. How have you kind of helped to provide that education to your kids and kind of encourage them to be part of your family business?
We're fairly transparent with how our family runs. We don't always necessarily tell them the exact dollar amounts and such. They're in all the different accounts, but we really want them to, what I'm really doing is just putting the infrastructure down. If we think about your family or think about a business in general, what happens during that startup phase? Well, you're putting together foundations, you're putting together systems, you're putting together process, you're putting together accountability, right? Which is what any startup would do. You're trying to find that proof of concept, which is where I'm trying to teach the kids, which is, okay, in order for you to grow, you got to have the foundation, which is understanding how to track money, understand how often you interact with things, and then also who's going to be your accountability partner to make sure that there's certain goals or things we need to happen, right? It's really easy to look at a spreadsheet and then, the next quarter realize you didn't do any of it. And so sometimes we just need that accountability partner, no different than, sometimes we need someone to count the push-ups we need to do that we all know we need to do them, but it's just easier if someone's there counting for us instead of relying on ourselves to do it. It's assembling the mentors or the board of directors that might be helping you. And then you're ready for growth, right? Which is the next step out of that startup phase.
Well, I like that idea of the startup, and it gets me thinking about VCs or venture capitalists as they're investing into their little startups, which aren't always little, that can grow quite large. But they don't just give them the money and then walk away. I mean, they're very involved at making sure that all of the pieces are there so those businesses can succeed. And often, though, we see families kind of doing the opposite. It's like they're giving the money and kind of hoping for the best, and maybe without the guidance or without the infrastructure in place or the structure or the education that's going to kind of get them there. So that really is a great analogy. I love that analogy, Walter.
Yeah, the idea behind this VCs, I mean, I was part of the startup world in the 2000s. When they come in, the whole point is they're bringing their structure into the business because presumably it's being run by, founders or people that don't have a lot of experience in running a business. And so the VC group brings in their people, right, to help really begin to scale this thing. And I think then the second step after your startup phase is the growth phase, right? And so that's when I would say when our kids start, getting into their careers a little bit, I think growth would also be would have the characteristics of being able to save some money, be able to have your emergency funds in place, have the right kinds of coverages in place. We're starting to really get into that growth mode. And then after the growth mode, in the business world, you become into that mature phase, that cash cow phase, which is probably more you and me, right? You're kind of at the top of your game. You're professionally been doing this a while, right? And so you're now an entrenched veteran. And then the last component of a business is the succession planning, right? At some point, a business is going to be passed on to the next generation, or it's going to close its door or be sold, right? And so that analogy, I think, holds true all the way through on the individual side, that we go through that startup phase, a growth phase, the maturity phase, and then the legacy phase. And so it's really helpful to understand what are some of the metrics that might go into those kind of phases for us to identify that that's where we are. And what are the goals of each of those phases that we can then be working towards, ultimately, hopefully, to get to that legacy phase where we're able to pass on lessons, pass on structure, pass on wisdom as much as passing on money.
Right. And with a family business or your family as a business, when you get to that succession stage, if a generation is living to 100 now, what would retirement look like at that point? And what would legacy look like at that point for those kids? How could you secure both making a gift to your children at some point, and then at the same time, also making sure that you're not going to run out of funds yourself?
Yeah, so that's the real challenge, right? So again, I would argue that depends on your wealth level, right? So if you're in the extreme high net worth, you're probably not as worried about running out of money, and you probably already are gifting funds or transitioning funds well ahead of the game. But if you're kind of at that mass affluent level, right? Maybe that $2 to $20 million level, then you still have a little bit of angst around the fact that there's a risk of maintaining your lifestyle and running out of money and providing a legacy. And the biggest challenge in retirement income planning today is that you can't answer two questions that are critical to the calculation of income, which is how long will I live, which is an unknowable number, and how well will my money perform, which we can't know either. And so when we have those two unknowns, then we typically have to fall back to more conservative techniques, which we might think of as the 4% rule, or some of those, the kind of rules of thumb that help us understand what's the maximum we can take out of a portfolio without running out of money in the long run. But a lot of research now is being done in this area because there are no pensions and people are living a long time. And so we're starting to look for solutions where we get rid of the longevity risk. And so that typically comes from the insurance world, where we could take advantage of things like actuarial science, where they understand kind of on average, how long will people live. And so we could take some of that old pension math and bring it to ourselves individually, where we could create our own pensions, where we can understand, okay, how do I begin to build a portfolio where I'm guaranteed not to ever run out of money, or I can have built in a guarantee where I will have a guaranteed legacy or gift to my children, maybe in the form of life insurance. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more of investments and insurances combined to create the perfect solution versus one or the other, like maybe in years gone by.
Reducing risk has got to be something everyone is interested in. So having a method that might be able to provide that for us, especially, because that's kind of a new, at least in my practice, that's a new awareness that, hey, what if I live into my late 90s? What if I live past that? And I often hear from clients they're reluctant to be making gifts early. One of the problems with that is Washington State, as a number of other states, has its own estate tax, and those exemptions are much lower. So gifting and moving assets out earlier, not only is that potentially reducing their estate tax liability, which is usually a goal, but it's also a way to complete the succession and move the assets and the wealth down also.
Yeah, I would argue, Derek, that good estate planning starts with income planning. Because all the things you're just talking about, which is if I don't feel secure in my income, I don't ever think I'll take advantage of all the trust planning that I can do. because I might be nervous to move money into places that have limited, restricted access or use or things like that. Where if I feel really good about my income, then all your advanced estate planning techniques are available to me. And so I think, the first step really is to, and I usually ask clients to answer these 4 questions. They're a little bit leading, but I'll tell them to you. The first question is yes or no. I'd like to generate my retirement income using the fewest dollars possible. And of course, people say yes. Second question is yes or no. I'd like to generate my retirement income taking the least amount of risk possible. And that's usually a yes. And the third question is I'd like to generate my retirement income with the highest level of probability possible. And that's generally a yes. And the last question is if I can, I'd like to leave the best legacy possible. And so when we think about retirement income planning, we want to be able to answer those 4 questions, because when we do optimize around those questions, there's either more for legacy purposes or I have more flexibility to do the legacy planning that your services provide.
And it reminds me of the hierarchy of needs. And so, if you are at the lowest level there, you're at subsistence, you're taking care of yourself, but you have to get to a higher level to be able to take care of your family, to be able to take care of your community, to be able to take care of society in general, or to be able to provide more back. And also that helps you to be kind of the most you can be. So you have to have that security. We all want to provide for ourselves, obviously, but also our family, our communities. And so having some security on that definitely allows them, I would say, to be able to get higher on that pyramid.
And you get that firsthand when you start talking with people who are kind of on that margin or that fence. And we talk about legacy. The first thing they'll say is, well, the kids will get whatever they are. Or they might say, no one gave me anything, so I don't plan on giving them anything. But then when you begin to really dial in and give them much more probability or confidence that their income is going to be okay, it's amazing how their minds change, right? As soon as their incomes feel good, now the generosity comes back out. And so a lot of times it's just a knee-jerk reaction to saying, I don't feel good about my income, but once I do, then I'm happy to start sharing. And so that's why I think, good estate planning really starts, with an income conversation.
On the other side of it, we're looking, if we look at where the children are, and we imagine what they might need besides yourself. So if you can get to that spot where you feel comfortable, you've taken care of what, your issues, and now you're thinking about maybe the next generation, they're in a tough spot too. And you've mentioned this already, but I look at it and they've got challenges. It's really a changing environment. The definition of marriage or relationships has been changing. Like you said, on jobs, those are changing. We look at maybe potential threats from AI, people being reluctant or having difficulty believing they're never going to be able to buy a home in the city they live in, maybe not being reluctant to get married or have children even. So this is something that is kind of interesting, because if they do have that security, maybe they can help those younger generations get past some of those issues to find some security in their lives and get to security on that lowest level also.
Yeah, we see the statistics are just shocking. If you go back to the like mid 80s, home ownership is basically cut in half. The age of the people who are married at age 30 is almost cut in half. So you're absolutely right. So we're starting to see this trend where the things that we took for granted in prior generations is a challenge or unattainable for a lot of folks today. And so again, if we think of our home as a business, then we know that every business is a business to maximize shareholder value. And so we think of our homes and we adopt that same idea that the home is there to maximize shareholder value, but I changed the spelling from VALUE to VALYOU, which means that we take the values of the family and we try to maximize those with the dollars that we have. What's important to our family. And that's, we know in the business world, it's one of the more powerful forces out there. If a CFO or a company misses their earnings, they get punished, right? And so we could take that same kind of idea, that same kind of business concept at the home front and say, okay, if providing for that, if we have this feeling of wanting to pass on to our junior shareholders, then we want to run our households with a more of a cash flow centricity than just a balance sheet approach. How do I create cash flow at every generation level, right? And teach our family that it's cash flow that matters, not a balance sheet.
Money isn't supposed to be, I don't think, it shouldn't be the root of all evil. It really should have purpose for us. It should help us to be better people ourselves, or find fulfillment ourselves, and also find fulfillment and help those we really care about.
And I have this conversation with the younger folks, which, we've all been told, don't ever buy the $6 Starbucks cup of coffee because it's a waste of money. And I would argue that if I'm running late or I'm lazy at home and I just go to Starbucks, that's true, right? We probably don't need to spend those $6. But if I'm at a Starbucks on a Saturday morning with my friends talking about Friday night, that might be the most valuable $6 I ever spent. And so it's just a question of what are my values, and is my money aligned with those values? And so we could find these little examples all throughout our lifestyles and our budgets to be able to understand that when I'm living my values, I feel fulfilled. And I think there's a difference between financial goals and values. And financial goals are more of a check the box item. Like, I want to get out of debt, or I want to buy a car, or I want to pay for kids' college, I want to retire. But all of those, in my opinion, have more of a fleeting sense of accomplishment to it, right? When you buy your car, for a while it smells great, and then at some point it gets its first ding, and you're past the excitement of the car. But when you're living your values, you have a different level of fulfillment, right? It's a permanent fulfillment. It's something that really gives you that sense of excitement about what life's all about. And I think far too often we try to substitute financial goals for the values, and just try to pretend like because I've been able to get out of debt, or, do something that's important along the way of living, it doesn't give us the same fulfilling feeling that it does when we're actually living our values. And so, and as we progress through life, those values typically stay fairly true, right? Values don't tend to change as much as financial goals do, right? A financial goal could change at any given time, right? We may decide we want to do this, and we decide to change our mind, or sometimes financial goals might actually be counterproductive against each other. But typically, when we identify what's important to us and what our values are, those don't change as much over life. And so, understanding that we can get some wins, even even if we're spending a little bit of money with our friends and family, or going on trips. There was a book called Die with Zero where that gentleman called those life dividends, right? And at the end of the day, life dividends is what gives us that sense of fulfillment along the way. And so when we plan for that, when we plan for values rather than just financial goals, I think we have a much better sense of accomplishment.
Well, I love bringing it back into the positive, and finding that it's actually true. I love the story you had there about Starbucks, and it reminded me that you are a fabulous storyteller, and reminds me of your book, The Fifth Option. In that book, you use the story framework to help really teach some financial lessons. Can you give us a little bit of background about that book and what it's about and how it works?
Yeah. So the fifth option was my attempt to take the modern financial planning research that's coming out from the academic world, Ernst & Young, some of these places that put out white papers that for most of us, we just don't want to read them. And so I thought it'd be a lot better if we took some of those white paper and the studies and turned it into a story form. And the idea behind the book is there's a couple who are getting ready to start talking about retirement planning, and they go to traditional financial planning sources, and they're given to the traditional financial planning conversations, and they realize that their retirement isn't going to be as great as they were hoping for. And as most financial planning, traditional financial planning tells you, if you're not excited about what the numbers say, you get 4 options. You can save more money, you could take more risk, you can work longer, or you can just understand you might have to live a little bit less. But luckily, there's a 5th option, which is the name of the book. And the 5th option is teaching people how to combine investments and actuarial science to optimize retirement income in a pensionless society. And so it takes them on this road of discovery where their fathers teaches them what the latest thinking is, right? And you can see them go on this journey of discovery and realize that there's better choices than what traditional financial planning offers.
Walter, let's talk a little bit about some of the structure. Another document that we create, of course, is trusts, and trusts can be very valuable. They can help us with our planning and protection, and they're also crossover with many of the things you've been already talking about. For example, life insurance earlier, and we might create a life insurance trust. How have you seen families react to the idea of a life insurance trust?
Life insurance, has that, initial stigma sometimes, but I think once we understand how life insurance works and how efficient it is and the job that it does, I think it becomes a very compelling estate planning tool. And the idea behind life insurance is you will never put into the policy anywhere near the amount of money that the death benefit will provide. And so it's a really efficient way of being able to generate a pot of money upon our death that can be used to pay off estate taxes or to be able to replace assets that we spent during our lifetime. There's got a lot of flexibility in terms of what it can do. And so I think also sometimes it's just the simplest way to handle estates that aren't that complicated, right? If we owe a little bit of tax to the state of Washington, it could be that a life insurance policy handles it very efficiently. We don't need a lot of elaborate trust systems or things that that maybe aren't warranted at that level. So it takes a little bit of education, but once we get people through that education, I think they really see the power of what life insurance can do in terms of being part of an estate planning tool.
Well, and you introduced me to an idea not that long ago where a family was interested in the insurance as the primary way to provide for their kids. And it gave them that freedom to be able to do whatever they wanted with everything else because they already had that insurance in place. And I thought, well, isn't that an interesting approach? Because that's kind of a low risk way to know you're going to provide for the kids. And it's just there and you don't have to worry about it after you get it up and funded.
Yeah, I think for the folks, again, that mass affluent levels, if I want to leave $1 million per child, for example, I got to carve out a chunk of my assets and I got to hold on to it. And I have this, kind of this tug of war of whether I want to spend it or not, right? Because, if I spend it, happy for me. But if I spend it, that I know I might be dipping into a legacy. But if I buy a life insurance policy for, much, much cheaper than the $3 million I would have to set aside, I have this net same effect where I can give each one of $1 million, but now I can spend my assets to zero, quite frankly. And I haven't disinherited the children at that point. So I think it's a much more efficient way of being able to say, okay, I can buy their legacy very cheaply, which allows me to spend more money during my own retirement.
Well, they could spend without guilt, right? There they go.
And they can spend without guilt. Yeah, right. And quite frankly, if I need the money, there's a cash value that grows in the life insurance policy. So if something goes wrong, I could claw back the money that I put into the life insurance policy back to, for my needs if I needed to, right? So I haven't irrevocably given it necessarily to the kids, for a period of time.
My father is the youngest of 7, and he is only survived now by his sister. So there's just the 2 of them. And the 2 of them then are with the rest of the cousins are the owners of the family corporation, which owns some very nice property. We had the opportunity to talk to Dad about this and then to be at the family meeting. And there's a lot of kind of division within that. And we actually had someone say, the G2s have had it enough. It's time for it to be moved to the G3s, in control. And that was kind of a painful thing to hear. It kind of brings us back into this whole idea because the problem that business has is that others like myself are definitely stakeholders, but we're not actually in the meeting, right? We're not actually voting on what happens with that. Spouses have been very important, but the spouses aren't part of it either. And so it's very closed in and very formalized, and not really kind of moving with where reality is in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, as I think about that family, that structure, that's not one that's going to last the 3 generations. It will come down, to our generation, but I don't know if we have a structure in place that'll be able to hold it together past this. As an attorney who's been doing this now for 30 years, I think about what could I have done more to help my dad or to help my family. And, I don't know if I had the tools and I didn't think about it, or I wasn't in a position with enough authority, but something like the family constitution, which would help cement the family values early on and help provide the education to others about, basic financial structures, about how these things work, and to have some kind of a legacy there. That would have been the way, I think, to help make it last longer.
Yeah, that's a great example of moving from that kind of mature phase to the legacy phase, where we have to understand how do we establish a legacy, a system, a way of passing this on to the next generation. that meets with the governance of the family values, but also is fair in terms of keeping this business going, right? I mean, the idea is that it's it provides a cash flow to the family, and so if we don't treat it well, it all goes away, right? And then everybody loses at that point.
Yeah, unfortunately, ours doesn't have much of a cash flow. It's much more of a heritage property that's more of a cash suck, but still a beautiful piece of property and something that's held the family together up until this point. And unfortunately, if that goes away, I think the family will be fractured also.
Yeah, that's well, that's no different than there's a fight on the shareholders or the board of directors or something at a company, right? It's the same dynamics. Money can be challenging.
But it also, I think, as we think about it with our own families, our closer knit families, and we think about this household as a business kind of concept and how we're involving the next generation and bringing them more into the policy or the process of this, we really don't know where it's going to go, because I don't think that my grandparents really knew what it would be like, 80 years later, 90 years later. And this is where we're at, but these stories start a lot earlier where, they really do. And so we have our opportunity here to plant some seeds and to create some legacy and some education with something like, even working as your household as a business and moving that forward.
And if we apply thoughtful metrics to the household, then that can really help us make decisions and evolve with the changing times, right? Because a lot of the metrics that a public company goes through in terms of how Wall Street analysts analyze them, that doesn't change. What does change is what are the strategies that have to be implemented to be able to meet those metrics to make sure the business shows health. And so we could adopt some of those same kind of easier metrics, but nonetheless, having a financial dashboard that lets us know, okay, how are we doing in certain areas? And if we're finding out that there's some challenges, then we have to adapt to the world we're in to try to get those back to a metric that shows health.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm thinking of this dashboard as I think about Family Wealth, the book, and in there there's talk about the different types of wealth, and wealth isn't necessarily just money, but it's the knowledge, of the kids. It's really the value of the relationships and all of this. And I could just kind of, how would we have the dashboard to show, how strong are our relationships? Where are we at on our education and our legacy here? But we do need to pay attention to all of it, really, if we want to have that success of it lasting. So it's not always just the money, but money is often part of the tools that we can use to maybe, hey, if we use some of this money here, maybe we can get, and we do that, right? When we send our kids to school, to college, I mean, we're taking our money to invest in their future, really.
Yep, exactly right. Yeah, and kind of my second step with this running a house like a business is maximizing shareholder value, where we spend the time with the families to discuss value. Like what are the values of the household? What is important? How we align ourselves with that, and that's always a very unique conversation with people. Then when you get past that, then it becomes much more mechanized because now we're running the business. But the values is what we're driving towards, right? And that's the part that I think most people don't really spend a lot of time with.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All the stories are going to be different from every family, aren't they? And that becomes their family wealth story over time. Walter, thank you so much for talking to me today. This has been great. And I look forward to reading that book or seeing the YouTubes when they do come out.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Love talking with you, Derek. Thanks.
These are hard issues. They take conversations. But you need two for conversations. Who do you need to have a conversation like this with? The best way to get started is to send them a link to this show. To stay up to date with Walter's course, you can check out his website, thefifthoption.com. We have that information linked in the show notes. Please rate and review wherever you are listening to this podcast. Subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. I'm Derek Jensen, and this podcast is presented by Jensen Estate Law.